They came draped in silk and ambition, one after another, a procession of noble daughters ascending the stone steps of Blackthorn Palace like carefully wrapped gifts delivered to a man who had long since forgotten the pleasure of receiving. Lady Charlotte Pembroke arrived first, her gown the deep red of crushed garnets, her voice trained since childhood to carry across grand halls. She sang for King Edmund Robinson on the first night, a ballad about longing and glory, her eyes fixed on his face the entire time, searching for the precise moment his expression would soften. It never did. Lady Isabella Hartwell came the second night, her pearl dress catching every candle in the great hall as she danced beneath the iron chandeliers. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had rehearsed this moment in front of mirrors for months. Her ladies-in-waiting clapped at the edges of the room. The court murmured their approval. The king watched with the patient stillness of a man waiting for rain to stop. Lady Victoria Langley tried wit on the third evening. She leaned close enough for her perfume to reach him, something floral and expensive, and whispered a joke that made the surrounding nobles laugh in advance, like courtiers applauding a play before the curtain had risen. Edmund Robinson did not smile. Not once. He sat on his carved wooden throne in the firelit hall of Blackthorn Palace, Britain's most powerful man, and its most unreachable, with a battle-axe resting at his boot and old scars running across his jaw like a map of every war he had survived. His fur-draped shoulders were square and still. His dark eyes swept the room with the distant patience of a man who had seen too many performances to be moved by another one. He was 39 years old. He had ruled Britain for 11 years. He had buried a wife and a war in the same terrible season, and something behind his eyes had not fully returned since. The court whispered about it constantly. The king is lonely. The king is cold. The king needs a queen and does not know how to want one. For 3 nights, Blackthorn Palace had glittered with candlelight and calculation as noble families from every corner of the kingdom delivered their daughters to the great hall. 43 women had arrived by the 4th evening. 43 had attempted something beauty, talent, wit, charm, and 43 had watched the same thing happen. The king's eyes would drift back to the far wall. His jaw would settle. The distance would return. Lord Charles Hawthorne, chief advisor to the crown, observed it all from his seat near the raised dais with the careful attention of a man cataloguing problems. He had arranged this gathering himself 3 weeks of planning, letters dispatched to every great house, favors called in across 4 provinces. The kingdom needed a queen, the council needed the king settled, and Hawthorne needed the next queen to be someone he had chosen. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had designed, except for the king's face. Edmund Robinson looked like a man being slowly bored to death. Then the doors opened on the 4th night, and the woman who entered was not what anyone expected. She was not announced. There was no herald, no fanfare, no practiced pause in the doorway to let the candlelight find her best angle. She simply walked in quietly, without performance, wearing a dress of plain grey-green wool that the noble women near the entrance visibly assessed and dismissed in the same glance. Her brown hair was braided loosely over one shoulder, tied with a small ribbon the color of dried roses. She carried nothing, no gift, no instrument, no carefully rehearsed smile. Hilda Horace moved through the hall the way people move through rooms they are not trying to own, and she made her way without hesitation, without permission, directly toward the king's table. The surrounding nobles stiffened. She did not curtsy deeply. She did not compliment the gold circlet pressed into his dark hair. She did not say anything at all. She simply pulled out the chair beside King Edmund Robinson, sat down, and set a small loaf of bread on the table between them, the plain, warm kind carried up from the kitchens. The kind servants ate as though she were settling in beside a tired man at the end of a long day, rather than positioning herself before the most powerful figure in Britain. The hall went very quiet. Lady Charlotte Pembroke, still near the front of the room, let out a sharp breath of disbelief. "You intend to speak with His Majesty?" she said. Hilda turned and looked at her calmly. "No," she said. Pause. "I intend to listen." No one in the hall moved. King Edmund Robinson, who had not looked directly at a woman all evening, who had stared past performers and beauty and rehearsed brilliance for 3 full nights, turned his head. He looked at Hilda Horace, not with irritation, not with the polite blankness he had given the others, with something that had not crossed his face in months: curiosity. His eyes moved from her face to the bread on the table between them, simple, warm, unremarkable, and something shifted in his expression that no one in the court could quite name. Around him, silk rustled and whispers sharpened, but the king said nothing yet. He simply looked at the woman who had not tried to impress him, and for the first time, in 3 days of performances, he did not look away. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. The court did not know it yet, but everything was about to change, not because of what Hilda Horace would say to the king that night, but because of what she would not say, and because of what Edmund Robinson, warrior king of Britain, had not said to anyone in 2 long silent years. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The music continued at the far end of the hall, a string quartet, playing something elegant and forgettable, and servants moved between the long tables carrying silver trays. Candles burned low in their iron holders. The night wore on around them the way nights do when no one is paying attention to anything except one thing, and the one thing every person in that hall was paying attention to was the plain woman sitting beside the king. The nobles watched her the way hawks watch an unfamiliar bird land in familiar territory. Lady Isabella Hartwell stood near the window with her arms folded, her expression composed into something just short of open contempt. Lady Victoria Langley whispered behind her fan to the woman beside her. Lord Hawthorne had not moved from his chair near the dais, but his eyes had not left Hilda Horace since she sat down. They were all waiting for the move, the flattery, the lean forward, the carefully timed laugh, the hand placed just close enough to the king's without touching it. Every woman in that room had a strategy, and they were experienced enough to recognize that silence could be one of them. A calculated pause before the real performance began. But Hilda did not perform. She looked at the bread on the table, broke a small piece from the edge of the loaf, and ate it. Then she looked at the fire burning in the great stone hearth at the side of the hall, and she simply watched the flames for a moment, the way a person does when they have nowhere urgent to be. King Edmund watched her do this. Then, as though the question had arrived before he had decided to ask it, he said quietly, "You're not going to sing for me." It wasn't a question. Hilda turned to look at him. "No," she said. "Or dance." "No. Or tell me something charming about your family's estate." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "We don't have an estate. My father is a physician in Aldenmere. Our most impressive possession is a very large bookshelf." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "Then what are you doing here?" Hilda considered the question honestly before she answered it. "I came because my father was invited as a courtesy. He treated several of your soldiers after the Northern campaign." She paused. "I came with him. I had no intention of entering the hall at all, actually. And yet here you sit, and yet here I sit." A silence. Then, "Why?" Hilda looked at him directly, the way very few people in that hall had looked at him all evening, not at the crown, not at the title, not at the careful arrangement of power and distance he wore like armor. At him. "You look tired," she said simply. "Not bored. Tired. There's a difference." Edmund said nothing for a moment. Around them, the music played. A servant refilled a goblet 3 seats down. The hall continued its performance of itself. "How long has it been?" Hilda asked. "Since someone asked you a question that wasn't about the kingdom." The king's jaw tightened slightly. Not with irritation, with something older than that. "I don't remember," he said. "Then I'll ask one." She settled back in her chair. "What did you eat for breakfast this morning?" Edmund stared at her. "That's your question." "That's my question." Something moved behind his eyes, confusion first, then something approaching disbelief, and then, faintly, like a door opening somewhere in a room, long closed, the ghost of amusement. "Bread," he said, "and cold venison, and coffee that had been sitting too long." "Terrible," Hilda said. "It was," he agreed. And then before either of them seemed to expect it, he said something else. something that arrived without the careful architecture of a king speaking to his court. Margaret used to insist on hot meals, even during campaigns. She'd send letters to the field kitchens. He stopped. Hilda did not react with the breathless reverence people usually showed when the king mentioned his late wife. She did not lean forward or soften her voice into something reverent. She simply waited, the way a person waits when they know the next sentence is the one that matters. Edmund looked at the fire. She said a man who eats cold food for long enough starts thinking the cold is normal. He was quiet for a moment. She was right about most things. She sounds like she was perceptive, Hilda said. She was. A pause. She'd have found this entire gathering absurd, incidentally. 43 women in silk trying to charm a man who doesn't know what he wants anymore. Do you know what you want? Edmund turned to look at her, a sharp look, the kind that in another conversation might have carried warning. But Hilda held it without flinching, without apology, with only the steady patience of someone who had asked an honest question and was genuinely waiting for an honest answer. The king looked away first. No, he said quietly. I stopped knowing that sometime around the 2nd year of ruling alone. He said it plainly, without theatre, the way exhausted people say true things when they have finally run out of the energy required to disguise them. Hilda nodded once. She didn't say, I understand. She didn't say, that must be so difficult. She didn't offer advice, or comfort, or the practiced sympathy of someone performing compassion. She just listened. And Edmund Robinson, King of Britain, veteran of 3 wars, widower, the man 43 women, had tried and failed to reach in 4 nights, kept talking. He spoke about the loneliness of the throne, about councils full of men whose loyalty he could not trust, about alliances built on marriages and debts, and the grinding commerce of power rather than anything resembling genuine regard. He spoke about the North, about the unrest growing there like a slow winter, about decisions he made in rooms full of advisors and still felt entirely alone in making. He did not speak like a king. He spoke like a man. And at some point, neither of them could have said exactly when Edmund said something that surprised even himself. And Hilda responded with a quiet observation so plainly true that it landed in his chest like something familiar he had forgotten he'd lost. And King Edmund Robinson laughed. It was short, surprised. A single, unguarded sound that escaped before he could contain it. The laugh of a man who had not expected to find anything funny and had been caught off guard by his own reaction. 3 tables away, Lady Isabella Hartwell stopped mid-sentence. Lord Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. A servant paused mid-step, looked toward the king's table, and then quickly looked away. The hall did not erupt, nothing so dramatic, but a ripple moved through it, quiet, invisible, undeniable, as the people closest to the throne registered what they had just witnessed. The king had laughed, and the woman sitting beside him had not done a single remarkable thing to earn it. That, somehow, was the most remarkable thing of all. By the time the last candles had burned to stubs and the nobles began filtering out into the cold corridors of Blackthorn Palace, the whispers had already begun spreading, soft and urgent and impossible to stop, passing from mouth to ear the way fire passes from candle to candle in a darkened room. Who is she? What did she say to him? How did she do that? No one had an answer, because Hilda Horace had not done anything, and that was precisely the problem. The invitation arrived at Hilda's door the following morning. Not a summons, the king's secretary had been careful about that. It was worded as a request, written on heavy cream paper, with the Blackthorn seal pressed in dark wax. His Majesty would be pleased by your company this evening, should you be available. Her father had read it twice, set it down on the breakfast table, and looked at his daughter with the expression of a man trying to calculate something he didn't have enough numbers for. Hilda had folded it neatly and said she supposed she would go. By noon, the entire palace knew. Lord Charles Hawthorne learned of it before the ink on the invitation was dry. He had people for that, quiet people, useful people, scattered through the palace staff like threads woven into a fabric most could not see. He heard about the invitation while reviewing trade documents in his private study, and he set his pen down with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that small things, left unexamined, had a habit of becoming large ones. He had watched Hilda Horace the previous night with the practiced attention of someone who had spent 30 years in royal courts, reading people the way other men read maps. He had expected to understand her quickly. He did not. She had no obvious strategy, no visible ambition. She wore no jewels. She had accepted no position near the king's table. She had simply occupied it, without permission and without apology, and then done the strangest thing Hawthorne had witnessed in 3 decades of court politics. Nothing. She had done nothing, asked for nothing, offered nothing, and somehow, inexplicably, the king had laughed. Hawthorne leaned back in his chair and pressed 2 fingers to his mouth, thinking. In his experience, the most dangerous people in any court were not the ones who wanted too much. They were the ones whose wanting was invisible. Lady Isabella Hartwell arrived at his study by mid-afternoon, which did not surprise him. She sat across from his desk with her back straight and her expression arranged into something that was meant to appear composed and only partially succeeded. "You saw it," she said. "I saw it." He laughed, Hawthorne. He hasn't laughed in this hall since before the Queen died. Her voice carried the particular tightness of someone who had invested significantly in an outcome now under threat. "I've been preparing for this gathering for 4 months. 4 months. And that woman walked in wearing a kitchen dress and sat down beside him like she owned the chair. And he, Isabella." Hawthorne's voice was quiet and precise, the way a blade is quiet before it cuts. Composure. She stopped, drew a breath, reset. "Who is she?" she asked. "I'm finding out." What he found did not satisfy him. Hilda Horace, 24 years of age, daughter of Dr. Aldous Horace, a physician of modest reputation practicing in the market town of Aldenmere, 2 days' ride from the capital. No noble blood, no political connections, no family with ambitions above their station. The father had been invited to the palace gathering as a minor courtesy. He had treated 14 soldiers wounded in the Northern Campaign the previous year, working without pay in a field hospital for 3 weeks, when the army's own physicians had been overwhelmed. The daughter had come with him. That was all. Hawthorne's investigator had added one further detail, almost as an afterthought. Hilda herself had also worked in that field hospital. Not as a physician, she had no formal training, but as a volunteer, changing dressings, sitting with men who were frightened, reading to soldiers who could no longer hold a book themselves. Hawthorne read the report a second time, then a third. No angle, no family maneuvering, no patron pulling strings behind her. She was exactly what she appeared to be, an unremarkable young woman from a decent, quiet family who had wandered into the great hall of Blackthorn Palace and accidentally done more damage to 3 months of careful political planning than 42 noble women in silk had done in 3 nights of trying. He found this profoundly unsettling. The palace staff had begun talking the way palace staff always talked, in low voices, in corridors, in the careful shorthand of people who knew that information was its own currency. The king ate a full breakfast this morning. He asked for the fire to be lit in the east sitting room before she arrived. He dismissed 2 council appointments to extend the evening. He smiled at the steward. The steward nearly dropped his tray. Small things, individually meaningless. But Hawthorne had built his entire career on understanding what small things meant when you arranged them in the right order. And what these particular small things meant was this. The king was warming. After 2 years of governing from behind a wall of polite distance, Edmund Robinson was beginning slowly, cautiously, as though testing ice he wasn't certain would hold to let someone in. And that someone was a physician's daughter from Aldenmere who asked simple questions and brought bread from the kitchens, and had no idea, apparently, that she was dismantling something Hawthorne had spent years carefully constructing. The king's isolation had been useful. A king who trusted no one depended on his advisor. A king who opened up, who found a confidant outside the council, outside the court, outside Hawthorne's careful network of influence, was a king who might begin to see things clearly. And there were things Hawthorne very much needed the king not to see clearly. He folded the investigator's report and held it over the candle on his desk until it caught. Hilda Horace had done nothing wrong. That was irrelevant. She would have to be removed. The second evening followed the same pattern as the first. Hilda arrived quietly, without announcement, wearing a dress of faded blue wool that one of Lady Hartwell's attendants later described with audible disdain as something a farmer's wife might consider modest. She carried nothing. She asked for nothing. She made her way to the king's table, sat in the same chair she had occupied the night before, and waited. Edmund was already there. He had been there, the steward privately noted, for nearly 20 minutes before she arrived. The visiting noblewomen had not given up. To their credit, several had redoubled their efforts. New gowns, new strategies, fresh determination. Lady Charlotte performed again. This time a piece she had clearly rehearsed, specifically for the king's reported preference for older ballads. Lady Victoria had commissioned a small poem written in Edmund's honour, and had it delivered on a silver card before the evening began. The king acknowledged, both with the brief, courteous nod he gave everything. Then Hilda sat down, and someone in the kitchen sent up a pot of tea no one had ordered, and Edmund wrapped both hands around his cup and said, without preamble, "Tell me something true." Hilda looked at him. "About what?" "Anything. Something you actually believe, not something polished." She considered for a moment. "I think most people in positions of power are lonelier than anyone around them is permitted to notice." The king was quiet for a beat. "Yes," he said, "that's true." And then he began to talk. Over the next 7 days, Hilda came to Blackthorn Palace 4 more times. Each visit settled into the same quiet rhythm, the whole performing around them, silk and music and rehearsed charm filling the candlelit air, and the two of them sitting slightly apart from all of it, speaking in low voices about things that had nothing to do with the evening's spectacle. Edmund spoke about the northern provinces on the third visit unrest, spreading through 3 counties, reports arriving that his council consistently downplayed in morning briefings. Tax collections had become irregular. 2 local magistrates had stopped responding to the Crown's correspondence entirely. He had raised both concerns in council 6 months ago, and been assured, smoothly and collectively, that the situation was being managed. "And is it?" Hilda asked. "I don't know," Edmund said. "And that's the problem. I used to know things. I had sources outside the council, outside the court. After Margaret died, I stopped maintaining them. I stopped." He paused. "I stopped paying attention to the things I should have been watching." Hilda said nothing. She did not fill the silence with reassurance. "There's a minister on my Eastern Trade Committee," Edmund continued, after a moment, "who has voted against Crown interest 11 times in the past 2 years. Each time Hawthorne assured me the man had sound reasoning. I accepted that." His jaw tightened. "I accepted a great deal I should have questioned." He looked at her. "You're not going to tell me what to do about it?" "No," Hilda said. "Why not?" "Because you already know what to do. You just needed to hear yourself say it aloud." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his cup and drank his tea and stared at the fire. And something behind his eyes was working quietly, calculating, reassembling, waking up. The palace staff noticed first, the way they always did. The king had begun arriving at council meetings early. He had requested the original documentation on 3 trade agreements that had been passed the previous year. Not the summaries, the original documents. He had sent a private letter to a military commander in the north, bypassing the usual channels entirely. He had dismissed his afternoon schedule twice, and spent the time in his private study with maps spread across the table and no advisors present. He had also, on 2 separate occasions, laughed during dinner. The kitchen staff discussed it over breakfast. The palace guards mentioned it in corridor shorthand. His personal steward, a careful man of 30 years' loyal service, wrote in his private journal that the king looked, for the first time since the Queen's funeral, like someone who intended to be alive for a while. Hawthorne noticed all of it. He sat in council on the 6th day and watched Edmund push back calmly, specifically, with the particular precision of a man who had done his reading against a trade proposal that had been quietly designed to benefit 3 of Hawthorne's closest allies. The king asked 2 questions that should not have been possible to ask without access to documents Hawthorne had ensured were buried in archive language. Edmund had found them anyway. Hawthorne kept his expression neutral throughout. He agreed with the king's concerns graciously. He promised a revised proposal by the week's end. Then he returned to his study, closed the door, and stood at the window, overlooking the palace courtyard for a long time. Below, in the late afternoon light, Hilda Horace was crossing the courtyard on her way out. She paused to exchange a few words with one of the younger palace guards, something ordinary, a brief smile, nothing remarkable, and then continued toward the gate. Hawthorne watched her until she disappeared. He had underestimated the problem. The king was not simply happier. The king was becoming himself again. And a king who was fully himself was a king Hawthorne could not manage. That distinction, he understood with cold clarity, changed everything. The hall emptied slowly that night, the way halls do when no one wants to be the first to leave, but everyone has run out of reasons to stay. The musicians packed their instruments. Servants extinguished the outer candles, working inward from the walls so that the light contracted gradually toward the center of the room, like a fire burning down to its last coals. The noblewomen departed in clusters, some with forced brightness, some with barely concealed frustration, all of them casting a final glance toward the king's table before the doors closed behind them. Edmund did not move. Neither did Hilda. When the last servant had withdrawn to a respectful distance and the hall had settled into the particular quiet of a large stone room at night, the king set down his cup and looked at the table for a moment, as though arranging words he had been carrying for some time and was only now deciding to put down. "I need to tell you something," he said. Hilda waited. "I've been building a case for 3 months," Edmund said quietly. Quietly, without the council's knowledge. "What I'm about to say I haven't said to anyone inside this palace." He looked at her directly. "I'm telling you because you're the only person in this building I currently trust, which is either a sign of good judgment or a remarkable one, given that I've known you for 9 days. Possibly both," Hilda said. The ghost of a smile crossed his face. Then it passed. "Hawthorne has been managing this kingdom for years," Edmund said. "Not ruling it, that distinction matters. I rule it. But he has been managing it the way a man manages a complicated machine he has no intention of relinquishing. Ministers who owe their appointments to him. Trade committees structured so that his allies' interests align with crown decisions. Information filtered through his office before it reaches mine." He paused. "I accepted all of it because, after Margaret died, I didn't have the energy to see it clearly. I trusted him to run the machinery while He stopped. "While I was elsewhere." Hilda said nothing. Outside, wind moved against the high windows. "He has been urging me to remarry for over a year," Edmund continued. "I understood that as political counsel. A king needs an heir. The kingdom needs stability. I accepted the logic." He looked at the candle between them. "What I didn't understand until recently is why he cared so specifically about which woman I chose." Hilda felt something shift in her thinking, a quiet rearrangement, pieces settling into a shape she had been half seeing for days. "He chose them," she said. It was not quite a question. "Most of them," Edmund said. "Not all. Some families sent daughters on their own ambition. But the ones he favored, the ones he mentioned repeatedly in private council, the ones whose fathers have business before the Crown's trade committee, he let the sentence complete itself. If you married a woman whose loyalty was to Hawthorne," Hilda said slowly, "he wouldn't need to manage the machinery anymore. He would be the machinery," Edmund said. "A queen who reports to him, an heir raised in his influence, and a king." He paused. A king who might never realize the walls had closed around him until they were already there. The silence between them was different now, heavier. Hilda looked at the table. She thought about the hall over the past 9 days, the women who had arrived, the ones Hawthorne had greeted personally, the ones he had steered subtly toward the king's sightline. She thought about the investigator she had noticed twice near her father's rented rooms in the city, a man she had mentioned to no one because she hadn't been certain enough to name it. She was certain now. "He knows you're changing," she said. "Yes, and he knows I'm the reason." Edmund did not deny it. Then he's not going to wait much longer, Hilda said. A man who has spent years building something doesn't dismantle it quietly. If he feels the ground shifting, she stopped, he'll move publicly, something large enough to be irreversible before you can respond. I know, Edmund said. Then you need to be ready before he is. I'm working on it. He looked at her. But Hilda, if he moves against you, then he moves against me, she said simply. I haven't done anything wrong. That won't matter to him. No, she agreed, but it will matter to you, and you're the king. Edmund studied her face for a long moment, the same steady, unperformative calm she had carried into this hall 9 days ago, and something in his expression tightened with a feeling that was harder to name than respect, and not yet ready to be named as anything else. 3 floors above the empty hall, Hawthorne stood at his desk. Before him lay a single sheet of paper. Not a letter, not a report. A list of names, witnesses, nobles with grievances, ministers who could be persuaded to speak publicly if the occasion were properly arranged. He had been planning cautiously. Now he planned quickly. The banquet would be in 4 days. And Hilda Horace, daughter of a country physician, volunteer at a field hospital, woman who asked for nothing and had somehow taken everything, would answer for it in front of the entire court. The rumors began the way rumors always begin in royal courts, not with a shout, but with a whisper placed carefully in the right ear at the right moment. Hawthorne was skilled at this. He had been doing it for 30 years. He did not spread the rumors himself. That would have been crude, and Hawthorne was never crude. Instead, he spoke in private to 3 people, a senior lady-in-waiting with a talent for conversation, a minor lord who owed him a significant favor, and a council secretary whose discretion was reliable in every direction except the one Hawthorne occasionally needed it not to be. He said very little to each of them. He asked certain questions. He expressed, quietly, certain concerns. The rest took care of itself. By the 2nd day, the whispers had reached every corner of Blackthorn Palace. The king's physician has no explanation for the change in His Majesty's behavior. She was seen entering the palace before sunrise. Alone. My cousin's husband serves on the Northern Trade Committee. He says the king has been asking questions no one prompted him to ask. Someone is feeding him information. There are herbs, they say, that affect a man's judgment, that make him trusting, compliant, attached. The witchcraft suggestion was the most effective, as Hawthorne had known it would be. It required no evidence. It explained everything and nothing simultaneously. And it carried the particular power of accusations that people half believe not because they have proof, but because they are frightened. And frightened people reach for the explanation that requires the least complexity. Some nobles received it with open credulity, others with skepticism. A careful middle ground, the largest group, has always received it, with the non-committal, of people who did not believe it entirely, but were not prepared to dismiss it either, which in practical terms amounted to the same thing. Hilda heard it on the 3rd morning from her father. He came to her room before breakfast with the careful expression he wore when delivering news he wished he could soften and knew he couldn't. He told her what he had heard in the market quarter, the physician's district, where people spoke plainly. He told her about the witchcraft claims specifically, because he knew she would hear it eventually and preferred she hear it from him first. Hilda sat with it for a moment. Then she went to the palace. She found Edmund in his private study, standing at the window with a document in his hand he did not appear to be reading. He turned when she entered. He had already heard. I think I should stop coming, Hilda said. Edmund set the document down. No, your reputation is mine to manage. His voice was quiet, but carried the particular flatness of a decision already made. I won't ask you to disappear, because Hawthorne has decided you're inconvenient. It isn't about what you're asking, Hilda said. I'm offering. There's a difference. If my presence is making things harder for you, your presence, Edmund said, is the reason I've slept properly for the first time in 2 years. It is the reason I walked into council last week and asked questions I should have been asking for months. It is the reason, he stopped, began again, more carefully. You have not done anything wrong. I will not allow you to be treated as though you have." Hilda looked at him. In 11 days, she had seen Edmund Robinson, tired, uncertain, quietly furious, and occasionally, briefly, surprisingly at ease. She had not yet seen him like this, still, resolved, and entirely certain. "This is the first time you've defended me," she said. "It won't be the last." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and said nothing more about leaving. Hawthorne announced the banquet that same afternoon. A grand gathering, all resident nobles, senior council members, diplomatic guests, palace staff of senior rank. A celebration, he called it, of the kingdom's continued prosperity. The king's secretary received the proposal and passed it to Edmund, who approved it with the brief nod he gave administrative matters that did not require his full attention. Hawthorne had been counting on exactly that. The banquet was in one day. His witnesses were prepared. His sequence was planned. He would allow the evening to reach its comfortable middle, wine poured. Guards relaxed, the court assembled, and unsuspecting, and then he would stand, and he would speak, and by the time Edmund understood what was happening, the accusation would already be in the air. Fully formed, public, and very difficult to answer without appearing defensive. A king who defended a woman accused of witchcraft and manipulation looked like a man already compromised. That was the point. Hilda did not sleep well that night. Not from fear, or not entirely, but from the particular restlessness of someone who can see a thing coming and has done everything sensible to prepare, and still cannot stop the hours moving toward it. She lay in the dark of her father's rented rooms and listened to the city settle into quiet around her. Tomorrow the court would gather. Tomorrow, Hawthorne would move. And Hilda Horace, who had walked into a palace with no plan and no ambition, and nothing to offer except the willingness to sit beside a tired man and listen, would find out what that was worth when the room turned against. Here, the banquet was everything Hawthorne had designed it to be. The great hall of Blackthorn Palace had been dressed for the occasion, fresh candles in every iron holder, the long tables arranged in formal rows, the good silver brought up from the vaults. Diplomats from 2 neighboring territories occupied the seats of honor. Senior council members filled the upper tables. Every noble currently residing at the palace had been invited, and every one of them had come because an invitation from the king's chief advisor to a grand banquet was not the kind of thing one declined without consequence. Hilda sat near the middle of the hall at a modest table, beside her father, who had also received an invitation and had accepted it with the quiet unease of a man who understood he was being included for a reason he had not yet identified. Edmund sat at the head of the hall on the raised platform, as he always did. He had spoken briefly with Hilda before the banquet began, a few words in a corridor. Nothing that would draw attention, and she had seen in his face that he knew, not the details, but the shape of it. "Be ready," was all he had said. The evening proceeded normally for nearly 2 hours. Food was served. Wine was poured. Conversation filled the hall with the particular texture of a formal gathering, polished on the surface, watchful underneath. Hawthorne moved through it gracefully, the perfect host, pausing at tables, laughing at the right moments, pressing shoulders with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own architecture. Hilda watched him and ate almost nothing. He stood when the dessert plates were being cleared. The timing was deliberate, late enough that the wine had done its work on the room, early enough that people were still fully present. He rose from his seat at the upper table, and the particular quality of his posture, the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being listened to, caused the hall to quiet around him in stages, table by table, the way a wave moves outward from a dropped stone. "Your Majesty," he began, with a respectful incline of his head toward Edmund. "My lords, distinguished guests." He paused. "Let the silence settle. It is my duty, painful as it is, to bring a matter before this court that concerns the integrity of the crown." The hall went very still. For the past 11 days, a woman without title, without political standing, and without invitation has inserted herself into His Majesty's private confidence. Hawthorne's voice was measured and grave, the voice of a man reluctant to say what must be said. "During this time, The king's behavior has changed markedly. His judgment on council matters has become erratic. He has questioned long-standing agreements without cause. He has withdrawn from trusted advisors in favor of a brief, weighted pause. A country physician's daughter, whose methods of influence this court has not examined, and whose intentions remain entirely unclear. He let that land. Around the hall, faces turned. Some toward Hawthorne, some toward Hilda, some toward the king. "I put it to this court," Hawthorne said, "that Miss Hilda Horace has manipulated His Majesty through means we cannot yet fully name, and that the Crown's interests require her immediate removal from Hawthorne." The king's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The hall contracted around the single word. Hawthorne stopped mid-sentence, and in the silence that followed, Edmund Robinson rose from his chair at the head of the room unhurried, entirely composed, and looked down the length of the hall, with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and is faintly relieved it has finally arrived. "You've made a claim before this court," Edmund said. "I'll give you the opportunity to support it." He paused. "Tell me what Miss Horace asked of me." Hawthorne blinked. "Your Majesty, it's a simple question. In 11 days of private access to the king, what did she request?" A beat of silence. "Power," Hawthorne said. "Influence over." "No." Edmund's voice was calm and absolute. "Try again." Hawthorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Position. A title, perhaps. Or, no." The king let the silence hold for a moment. "Wealth. Land. Appointment for her father. Information. Advantage of any kind." He looked around the hall slowly. "In 11 evenings, this woman asked me for nothing. Not once. I want this court to hold that fact while I show them something else." He nodded toward the door. 2 men entered, not guards, not council staff, private investigators, quiet men Edmund had employed outside normal palace channels 6 weeks ago, before Hilda had arrived, before any of this had begun. They carried a document case between them. What followed took 20 minutes. Trade agreements with signatures that didn't belong. Council votes recorded differently in 2 separate sets of minutes. One for the official record, one kept in a locked drawer in Hawthorne's office, that his own secretary, it emerged, had copied under quiet duress. Letters between Hawthorne and 3 noble families, whose daughters had attended the gathering letters that discussed not romance but leverage, not matrimony but control. The hall received it in stages. Confusion first, then the gradual, uncomfortable rearrangement of understanding that occurs when people realize the architecture they have been living inside was built for someone else's purpose. Hawthorne stood at his place through all of it. His expression remained composed for longer than most men could have managed. But composure, Hilda had learned, was not the same as stillness, and she could see, from where she sat, the precise moment it began to cost him something. "Lord Hawthorne," Edmund said, when the last document had been presented, "you came before this court tonight to accuse a woman who asked me for nothing." He looked at him directly. "I am asking this court to consider what you asked for, and what you took." The silence was complete. Then Edmund looked toward the door, and the guards stepped forward. Hawthorne recovered quickly. Hilda had expected that. A man who had spent 30 years navigating royal courts did not collapse at the first application of pressure. He straightened at his table, drew a measured breath, and addressed the hall with the composure of someone who had prepared for this possibility and had prepared well. "Your Majesty." His voice was steady, respectful, wounded, even the particular wound of a man falsely accused. These documents require context that a selective presentation cannot provide. Trade agreements of this complexity necessarily involve. "Lord Mercer," Edmund said. A senior council member near the upper table rose slowly from his seat. He was 60 years old, grey-haired, and had served on Edmund's council for 9 years. He looked at Hawthorne with the expression of a man setting down something heavy he had been carrying for too long. "The vote on the Aldenmere trade revision," Edmund said. "Tell the court how it was recorded in the official minutes." Mercer clasped his hands in front of him. 4 in favor, 3 opposed. "And how did you actually vote, Lord Mercer?" A pause that carried the weight of everything unsaid in it. Opposed, Mercer said quietly, as did Lords Fenwick and Carrow. The record was altered before it reached the archive. The hall absorbed this in silence. Hawthorne turned toward Mercer with an expression that was no longer wounded. It was something harder. You would perjure yourself before the Crown based on, "I have the original tally sheet," Mercer said. I kept it because I knew this day would come eventually, and I was not certain I would have the courage to speak when it did. He looked at the king. I am speaking now. After that, it moved quickly. Lord Fenwick confirmed Mercer's account. A palace secretary, young, visibly frightened, clearly relieved, produced a second set of council minutes that had been maintained in parallel to the official record for over 2 years. A merchant factor, called in from an anteroom where he had been waiting since before the banquet began, described in plain commercial language a series of import arrangements that had redirected significant crown revenue through a private account connected, through 2 intermediaries, to Hawthorne's family estate. Each witness was brief. Each account was specific, and each one removed another section of the architecture Hawthorne had built until what remained was no longer a structure but a collection of exposed pieces that could not be reassembled into anything defensible. Hawthorne attempted it twice more. Once with legal argument, the jurisdictional complexity of the trade arrangements, the ambiguity of council procedure. Once with something closer to appeal, 30 years of service, decisions made under pressure, the difficulty of managing a kingdom during a period of war and grief and political instability. That second attempt landed badly. The hall understood what was not being said in it, that he had used the king's grief as cover, and that the king was in the room and could hear him say so. Edmund did not respond to either attempt. He simply waited, with the patience of a man who had the evidence and the authority and had no need to argue. Lord Charles Hawthorne. The king's voice carried to every corner of the silent hall. By your own record and the testimony of this court, you have manipulated the instruments of this crown for private advantage. You have altered official records. You have compromised the council's independence. And you came before this gathering tonight intending to destroy an innocent woman in order to protect what you had taken. He looked at him steadily. You will be remanded to the custody of the Crown's Justice Office pending a full accounting. He nodded toward the guards at the door. Hawthorne said nothing as they approached. Whatever composure remained to him, he used it for that to walk out of the great hall of Blackthorn Palace without being led, without stumbling, with his back straight and his face arranged into an expression that gave nothing further away. The doors closed behind him. The hall remained quiet for a long moment. Then Edmund turned, and for the first time that evening looked directly at Hilda across the length of the room. Miss Horace came to this palace without title or invitation, he said, to the court, and to no one in particular. She did not advise me. She did not maneuver. She did not ask for a single thing. He paused. She listened, and because she listened, I remembered how to think clearly. He looked around the assembled faces, nobles, diplomats, council members, staff. That is the full extent of her influence on this crown. I wanted this court to know it plainly. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Softer, something in it that resembled, if not quite shame, then recognition. Lady Charlotte Pembroke looked at her hands. Lord Mercer gave Hilda a brief, sincere nod. Several faces that had watched her for 11 days with suspicion now held something more complicated and considerably more respectful. Hilda's father, beside her, reached over and placed his hand quietly over hers. She did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Outside, somewhere beyond the palace walls, the city went about its evening unremarkable and steady, the way life continues after the thing that threatened to disrupt it has been removed. Inside Blackthorn Palace, for the first time in a very long time, the air felt clean. 3 weeks passed. The council was restructured quietly, and without ceremony 3 ministers replaced, 2 appointments reviewed, a new record-keeping procedure implemented that required dual verification on all official votes. Lord Mercer was asked to serve in an expanded capacity. The northern provinces received a direct communication from the Crown, bypassing the usual administrative channels, and 2 of Edmund's most trusted military commanders were dispatched to assess the situation with their own eyes, rather than Hawthorne's filtered reports. The palace settled into something it had apparently not been for some time. Itself. Hilda had returned to Aldenmere with her father the morning after the banquet. There had been no dramatic farewell. Edmund had sent a brief note private, not formal, thanking her for her presence and her honesty, and wishing her safe travel. She had read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the inside pocket of her travelling bag where it rode against her ribs the 2 days home. She went back to her father's house. Back to the bookshelf her father had described to the king. Back to the ordinary rhythms of a modest life in a market town, the morning routines, the neighbours, the work her father needed help with, the small and unremarkable architecture of days that asked nothing extraordinary of her. She had been home for 9 days when the second letter arrived. This one was longer. The palace gardens were at their best in early summer. Hilda had forgotten that, or rather, she had never known it, having arrived at Blackthorn Palace in the grey end of autumn when the gardens were bare branches and dormant earth. Now, walking through them in the long gold light of a June evening, she understood why people wrote poems about this particular place. Roses climbed the stone walls in cascades of cream and deep pink. Lavender lined the gravel paths in low purple rows. The air smelled of warm stone and cut grass, and something floral she couldn't name. Edmund was already there when she arrived. He was standing near the far wall where an old apple tree spread its branches over a worn stone bench, still in his council clothes, no crown, no ceremony, the fur-trimmed formality of the great hall entirely absent. He looked like a man who had come outside to breathe, and had been standing there long enough that the breathing had worked. He turned when he heard her on the path. "You came," he said. "Your letter was persuasive," Hilda said. "I wasn't certain it was. I wrote 4 versions." She smiled. "Which one did you send?" "The shortest one. The others were." He paused. "Complicated." She sat on the stone bench beneath the apple tree, and after a moment he sat beside her, leaving between them the same comfortable, undemanding space. They had always maintained the space of 2 people who had learned each other's company without needing to fill it. The sun moved toward the horizon. The garden light turned the color of old honey. Edmund looked at his hands. "I want to tell you something," he said. "I've been trying to find the right words for it since the night of the banquet, and I haven't, entirely. But I think I've waited long enough." Hilda waited. "After Margaret died," he said, "I was surrounded by people every hour of every day. Council, staff, advisors, visitors. The machinery of the kingdom does not pause for grief. I learned that within the first week." He was quiet for a moment. "I was never alone, and I was completely alone. For 2 years, those 2 things were simultaneously true, and I had stopped expecting that to change." He turned to look at her. "You changed it. Not by doing anything remarkable. Not by solving anything or advising anything or performing any of the things people perform when they want something from a king." His voice was steady and unhurried. "You simply sat beside me and let me be a person. You gave me silence that didn't ask anything of me. I had forgotten that was possible." He paused. "I don't think you understand how rare that is." Hilda held his gaze. "I think you needed someone to remind you that you were still there." "Yes," Edmund said quietly. "That is exactly what I needed." The garden held them in its long summer quiet birdsong somewhere in the apple tree above them. The distant sound of the city beyond the palace walls. The small and ordinary music of an evening in June. "I would like you to stay," Edmund said. "Not as an advisor, not in any formal capacity." He considered his next words carefully. "As someone I trust, as someone whose company I—" He stopped, began again. "I am not asking you to decide anything today. I am asking you to consider the possibility of more time, more evenings, more honest conversation." The corner of his mouth moved. "More bread from the kitchen, perhaps." Hilda looked at the roses, climbing the old stone wall. She thought about the letter she had carried home against her ribs for 9 days, about the 4 versions he had written and discarded, about a king who had spent 2 years frozen inside his own silence and had thawed, Not because someone had been brilliant or beautiful or strategic, but because someone had simply stayed still long enough to hear him. "Yes," she said. Nothing more elaborate than that. Just yes, the same plain, honest currency she had always traded in. Edmund looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had first glimpsed on the night she sat beside him. Not the careful blankness of a king managing his court, but something unguarded and genuine and quietly astonished, as though he kept expecting the warmth to be temporary and kept finding it wasn't. The sun finished its descent behind the palace walls, the garden filled with the soft blue of early evening, and in a kingdom where power had always belonged to the loudest voices, where silk and ambition and carefully rehearsed performance had long been the currencies of influence. The woman who had changed everything sat quietly in a garden with a tired king who was learning, slowly, that he was no longer alone. She had not seduced him. She had not flattered him. She had not asked him for a single thing. She had only listened, and that, in the end, had been everything. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Your voice is what decides what gets told next.